Okay, guys, we are live. Here we go. Welcome to the Heroes Lecture Part 2, Version 1. And here we're going to take a little bit of a turn. We've talked about this hero's narrative, this strange narrative that seems to be, well, you could hypothesize that it's woven into the fabric of our reality. The evidence, maybe anecdotal evidence, is that all cultures, all peoples across all of history seems to agree that this story is like a primary story in our lives, deeply motivating, deeply satisfying, one that we seek to embody, that we want to hear it told to us over and over again, that it seems to be the salvific story of our existence, that this seems to solve the problem of being. This is the hero's narrative, the grand narrative that almost exists in the background. It's just there. It's just omnipresent, and we instinctively move towards it. The hero story, the protagonist who steps into his destiny, who faces his fears, reemerges, and saves his people. Right. This is the story. But we're gonna have, you could say, a Mr. Miyagi moment where I don't know if you saw the Karate Kid. Mr. Miyagi has Daniel-san do a number of chores, painting the fence, or maybe this is painting the fence, painting the house, sanding the floors, wax on, wax off. And Daniel-san didn't really know why he was making him do this. He was getting frustrated, but then later it was revealed. So we're going to have a Mr. Miyagi moment and talk about something very interesting. There's only one currency in all of reality, and that's dopamine. Andrew Huberman, the head of the neurology lab of Stanford, so a guy who knows a thing or two about the brain. There's only one currency in all of reality, and that's dopamine. We're going to be talking about dopamine today. We're going to be talking about how our neurochemistry, our neurophysiology is set up. And this may give us some insight into the reality, the fullness of the reality of this hero's narrative. So, okay, take a look at this guy. This is the mesolimbic reward pathway. This is also just called the reward pathway. This is the primary motivational reward system that exists within our neurophysiology. So here we have the VTA, which is the ventral tegmental area. This is where a lot of dopaminergic or dopamine neurons live. And let me see where the nucleus accumbens is. Yeah, it's in part B. So they get fired off. Dopamine gets fired into this nucleus accumbens area. Yeah, this is another interface. So this A and B, this is where a lot of dopamine neurons live. So we're going to be talking a lot about motivation on a neurochemistry level, and we're getting into our design. So let's talk about it. How are we set up? How does this system work? How do we drive the machine? Well, we essentially have two major systems, and I think you could say two major systems. One is voluntary, one is involuntary. The involuntary is the autonomic system, and you could say this is our inner beast. This is the animal that we live in. Fight or flight, digestion, these are all the things that happen without us thinking. And these are the very quick responses. So, for example, if someone bumps into you, you have an autonomic arousal response. It might be a rage response. And it's instantaneous. You immediately, this animal thinks it's threatened, right? When you see a beautiful person, a sexy person, you have an instinctual desire. So a lot of these are regulated by the autonomic system, or executed by the autonomic. So the main systems of the autonomic are going to be your breathing, your heart rate, and your digestion. And that should make sense, because when you're very afraid, what happens to your heart rate? What happens to your breathing? Or your digestion, for that matter, when you're very anxious? Now, these autonomic systems are essentially controlled by the thinking brain, which is the prefrontal cortex. If you go back to our display here, the prefrontal cortex, part E, this is the thinking brain. This is the conscious center. And when we say conscious, I want you to think voluntary. That's going to be a key word, is voluntary. So the hypothalamus, this breathing, the heart rate, right, the autonomic system, flight or flight, rest and digest, a lot of those systems are involuntary. And this we could call it the animal. The animal system is default on, meaning that if we didn't have anything to regulate it, if there was no governor or dial, like think of it of like a volume dial on the stereo. If there's no dial, the stereo would always just be on loud. We'd be like animals, like furtively hiding or running towards something, running away from something, sleeping. You know, it would just be very instinctual. But because of the prefrontal cortex, we now have this voluntary mechanism where we can now influence our autonomic system. The prefrontal cortex is very interesting. You could think of it as a rule-setting device. It is a flexible rule-setting device. What it does is it is responsible for creating different contexts. Yeah, it contextualizes our world and regulates our autonomic system so that it matches the perceived context of the situation that we're in. So, for example, maybe you're sitting here, you're sitting at your desk listening to this podcast, or you're washing dishes, or maybe you're even running. Your prefrontal is telling you what your context is. If you're just calmly sitting in your room, what your thinking brain is telling you is that we're safe, that there's no need to be afraid, that there's no predator hiding underneath your bed or in your closet. And so your heart rate and your breathing, your rate of breathing and your digestion are all sort of in a calm, regulated state. And so the prefrontal is sort of this braking mechanism. Now, let's see. Now, what happens when you get into different situations, different scenarios? Your prefrontal right. So if you're in a situation where it's very high stress and you have this what you call limbic, I think limbic is the emotional system. You have a limbic rage response. Then one thing that's interesting about the prefrontal cortex is that it's not specifically needed for motor functioning. It's not it's somewhat extraneous to the execution of purely physical tasks. So, for example, let's say I were to give you a gun, and I were to give you a list of targets, set up a bunch of targets. If I were to shut off your prefrontal cortex, you would become like a physical genius. You would hit each target perfectly. Now, the main problem, though, is that you probably wouldn't stop at the targets. You would start shooting everything in sight. You would probably shoot me, shoot people in the eye, whatever. Like, without the prefrontal cortex, the machine is non-differentiating, meaning it can't distinguish between a good target and a bad target. And so you could think of that like in different situations. So again, the example of someone bumping into you, without the prefrontal cortex, you simply think you're under attack. When you have a limbic rage response, rage is non-differentiating. And you've probably had the experience with a loved one where you lose your temper on them, suddenly you're treating them like they're the worst person on the planet. It's because in that moment of rage, you cannot differentiate. It's an automatic, involuntary response. And that's usually where we get into problems, is when we let the autonomic system lead the dance. What's supposed to happen is the prefrontal cortex, this thinking brain, is supposed to be in the lead. But sometimes that's the struggle. And that's kind of where you get into a lot of these spiritual things where it's like you have to access your thinking brain, it requires a very conscious effort to control and control is a very like discipline and prayer and meditation. These are all things that these are all practices that help you put the prefrontal cortex in the lead of your autonomic system. So anyways, just to say, this is how we're composed. We have this sort of these animal functions, these very complex functions like digestion and like the liver. Like I don't know how the liver works or the pancreas. I certainly don't flex my heart, 60 times a second or whatever it is to keep the blood pumping. None of this is conscious. We have this autonomic system that kind of runs. But we also have this prefrontal cortex that is kind of like a conductor. It orchestrates all these systems, and this is kind of the one thing that we have control of. So this is our configuration. This is how we're built. We have this structure that runs kind of on its own, that's primarily instinctual, that doesn't have a sophisticated sense of its context. And then we have this other system, the prefrontal cortex, a voluntary system that is able to contextualize and interpret signals and has a massive degree of sophistication and subtlety and differentiation. I mean, you can think about, like right now, for example, like not to like, whatever, like I have this shoulder pain, okay? But one thing that I've been thinking about, like with the shoulder pain, is how specific this pain is. Like, it's not just pain. It's a pulling sensation, so I can tell that it's pulling. It's a numbing sensation, so I have this tingly running here. It's sore. There's a burning sense. Like, there's multiple sensations that are informing me, that's informing my prefrontal cortex of the nature of this pain. And then my thinking brain is trying to diagnose what exactly is wrong based on the pain signals that I'm receiving. So just to say that, right, your prefrontal is voluntary, differentiating. You have relative control over it. But then it's also somewhat in competition with this autonomic, involuntary, instinctual system that almost fights for control. Like, it sends such strong signals. It's telling you something like, hey, we're in danger, or we're safe, or we need to run away, or we need to attack. These rage responses, sexual desire responses, cravings, these sorts of things, these signals, they file into the prefrontal cortex. They're default on. And so if we just shut off our thinking brain, like, it feels good to let go, right? To just give in to our anger, just to let loose with our temper, right? It feels great in the moment. And then usually, we reap the the unfortunate rewards from that. Usually a few minutes or a few days later, like we'll get fired from our job or make someone cry, whatever. So this is the configuration that we're in, right? Now, let's get to this dopamine system. So when we're talking about the prefrontal cortex, what did I say? This system, the prefrontal is in charge of directing the machine, right? And when I say directing, what we're talking about is motivation. Now, what the prefrontal is designed to do, so when I talked about that, again, we'll go back to this scenario of someone bumping into you. Someone bumps into you. You have a limbic rage response, right? You feel threatened. Depending on how hard they bump into you, depending on what kind of day you've had. If you're really tired, things have been getting to you all day, you've been having a bad day, that limbic rage response might be quite acute. And it's a huge signal that gets sent. Now, what happens is your prefrontal will contextualize it and say, oh, I'm just in the subway and there's a million people and he just accidentally bumped into me. And that person might turn around and say, oh, sorry. And then you receive a calming signal to the rest of your body. Now, what's happening there is that your prefrontal is spinning up different narratives. It's spinning up alternative selves. And so, like, a great quote that I've heard is, the purposes of our thinking is we let our thoughts die so that we don't. Like, when you're in different situations, what you do is you try to contextualize the situation. You tell the story. The story of the autonomic system might be this man's attacking me, right? In the case of someone bumping into you, but the prefrontal says, "Oh no, the story is actually we're in a subway. He accidentally bumped into me, and we're not in any threat." And so essentially, what the prefrontal is doing, especially the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you want to get technical with it, this is responsible for making plans, for spinning up different context, and for visualizing different futures. So now this is very key to motivation, because when you think about what motivation is, how do you, when you think about planning for your future, think about things that you desire, or you're considering different possibilities, like should I get this job or should I get that job? What you do is you imagine what it would be like to be in that particular job. So like when I was thinking about different jobs, like, after the whole Bitcoin washout and I was trying to, how do I get back on my feet? I thought about, well, I could work in an office. What would that look like? Maybe I could work for some kind of like cool startup, like tech startup, financial tech startup, fintech startup. I could go into real estate sales, and I try to imagine the story of, imagine me being in that scenario. I imagine sitting in an office. I maybe picking up the phones. Maybe it's fast paced. I'm in a real estate office. I'm wearing this horrible suit. I have to go into a car and talk to some asshole about, like, you picture these scenarios. And so that comes from the prefrontal cortex. And basically what that means is the prefrontal cortex is a storytelling device. That when it spins up different, like, this is primarily what it is. It's a rule setting, a contextualizing rule setting device. So you could think of it in terms of like, if you're at a party or if you're in a classroom, your behavior is going to be much different. That comes from your prefrontal cortex because it has a number of rule sets that it has developed over time. Just, you grow up and you know what it's like to be in a classroom, you know what it's like to be in playtime, and your parents and your teachers and your peers are always telling you, always telling you when you're not applying the right rule set. And so you've evolved this rule set over time. And these rule sets kind of take the shape of a story. They're kind of like stories, like, oh, this is the world, right? This is the world, this is me in the world. That's what a story is. So the world is, I'm in a classroom. This is me, I'm a student. Well, this is what a student does in a classroom. He's quiet, he listens, he asks questions, he tries to engage, he tries to learn. Right, so essentially this left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a storytelling device. It's a narrative generating machine. You can think of it as a simulative exploratory generator. And that's how you're able to explore the world in a safe way. So, like, one thing Peterson was saying in this podcast with Andrew Huberman, and by the way, I'm going to put all my sources below, just so you can do your own research. I'm certainly not a neurologist, so I'm just kind of going based on these podcasts, which I think are pretty good sources of knowledge, but they're sort of new too. So anyways, like when you think about survival strategies, you could think of like mosquitoes. So what mosquitoes do is they lay like 1 million eggs, and then 99.9999% of them die. But then a few of them make it because they happen to, there's a certain variation in their gene where they are adapted to this future. And so the strategy of the species to move forward in the world, to continue to prosper, is to actually generate numerous physical selves, each with slight variations. And then the ones that are most adaptive to the present situation are the ones that survive. And then they lay eggs, and then a bunch of that, and they're constantly adapting to the changing horizon of the future by multiplying themselves. But humans don't do that. We have one or two, whatever, 1 to 5 offspring. We spend 18, 20 years, 30 years developing those few number of offspring, and we hope those offspring are able to adapt to the world. Someone joined me here. Hey, how's it going? How's it going, one person? All right, nice to see you. Okay, I hope this is all making sense. Anyways, but what we do instead, we were born with an enlarged left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right? And what this thing does is it spins up imaginary selves. Think about the number of thoughts that you've had that were completely stupid. Like, oh, should I don't know. I was thinking, I thought about all these different jobs that I could do, and none of them seem great. Like, I don't want to be a real estate agent. I don't want to work in an office. I don't want to do sales. I don't want to talk to some dude that keeps saying awesome. Awesome. Okay, that sounds, wow, that's fantastic. Like, I don't want to do none of that shit. Now, instead of me going and doing those things and discovering, what I did was is I spun up scenarios, imagining myself in that world. This is the world. This is me. This is me. Like, this is the world real estate. There's an office. There's a bunch of other real estate agents there. This is me. I'm a real estate agent. Okay, what does that person do? How does that feel? We try on different selves. So when you think of what a narrative is, what are stories actually? Stories are exploratory simulations. They're exploratory simulations. It's a way in which you explore the world so that you don't actually have to explore it. You're using your mind to investigate different contexts so that you can adjust your aim. That's what narratives are. That's what stories are. Stories are exploratory simulations, and this is a survival mechanism. Okay, so we have that, right? We have the prefrontal cortex, this conscious thinking brain. It's a flexible rule-setting device. It is an exploratory, simulatory device. It's a narrative-generating device. We perceive our world through narratives. The prefrontal cortex has influence over this autonomic system, the machine. And actually what's really interesting is that when you're in a high autonomic arousal state, whether it's like rage or sexual desire or any number of states where you want to run away, fear, the best thing to do, you want to keep your prefrontal cortex as the conductor, as the captain of the ship. And what the prefrontal will do is it wants to spin up different scenarios so that it can interpret the signals that it's getting from the autonomic system, the extreme fear, extreme rage, extreme desire, right? But it takes a little bit of time for it to do that. And when the prefrontal actually starts to spin up different contexts, and you've experienced this, it sends a calming signal via the vagus nerve, and that calms your breathing, your heart rate, and your digestion. And if you ever had a moment where you're in deep rage and you step away and you can kind of separate yourself from the intensity of the situation, what happens is you start to get calm, and then you start to spin up other scenarios. Well, maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe I interpreted it wrong. Maybe I'm just being sensitive. Maybe they just had a bad day, right? You just have all these different stories that you tell yourself, and you're trying to figure out which story matches the context the best. The world presents itself to us as a riddle, and then the prefrontal spins up stories to solve the riddle. Okay, so we have this idea that the prefrontal is a storytelling device, and that it has control over this limbic system. Now let's talk about motivation. What is motivation? How is motivation expressed? Let's try to build this, and we're going to do this in real time because I still am trying to think through this. The simplest form, the simplest expression of motivation, what do you think it is? What's the simplest expression of motivation? Is it a thought? Is it accomplishing something? Is it going to the kitchen and getting a drink of water? Kind of. But the simplest expression of motivation is movement. Your heart beats. Why? There's a reason why your system is beating your heart. There's a reason why your lungs are expanding and contracting involuntarily. Movement is the most basic form of motivation. And what is movement regulated by? It's regulated by dopamine. Isn't that crazy? Isn't that interesting? You know, we've heard a lot of pop psychology about dopamine, that it's a feel-good chemical. We want that dopamine hit, that our phones are like these dopamine hypodermic needles where you can administer dopamine as we doom scroll and tap on these screens. But it goes so much deeper than that. Without dopamine, we literally can't move. It's pretty crazy. There's a story of I think it was some amphetamine or something like that. These drug addicts, and they injected this drug, and it happened to be someone who made this chemical. They like kind of fucked up. They made the wrong chemical, and what it did is it destroyed their dopamine neurons. And without dopamine, they became paralyzed. They couldn't. It's like super sad, but it's also kind of interesting. Like, without dopamine, we can't move. Dopamine is the precursor to all the energy that we use to operate our systems. So in the brain, it takes the form of norepinephrine. In the body, it's called adrenaline. It's chemically identical, I think. Yeah, but they behave, I guess, a little bit differently, whether it's in the brain or in the body. So dopamine allows for movement via the production of noradrenaline and adrenaline. Dopamine is our primary reward system. It's our primary motivation system, even down to our movement. I mean, down to my hands moving, down to my eyes moving. You're watching the screen, maybe it gets sidetracked and moves over there. Maybe you hear a sound and you turn your head, right? That's all dopaminergically regulated. So everything in life is a motivation. Everything you do in life has an aim. Whether you're getting up and going to the bathroom, grabbing a slice of pizza out of your fridge, texting that girl or guy, working at a job so you can get a paycheck, all these things are motivational. And motivation is a strange thing, because what we desire becomes an identity. Our aim translates into meaning. It's a little bit, it's almost like there's this UFC fighter, and he said this is a guy who risks his life for a living on a daily basis. He gets punched in the face on a daily basis. He endures physical pain all day long, and he goes, you know what I'm really terrified of? And they're like, what is it? I am terrified of retiring. And they're like, why? He's like, because I've been chasing a 10-pound piece of gold. He means a championship belt. I've been chasing this belt all my life, and if I stop chasing this belt, I don't know who I'm going to be anymore. That's a dopamine statement, that this motivation defines who he is. So dopamine is this primary reward system, and the reason why Huberman calls it the single currency in all of reality is because you could think of reality as a series of inducements and rewards. We're driven forward by something. We're motivated to do something, right? All organisms, even worms, have dopamine systems embedded in them. And they're driven forward by it. All of the things, like your sense of well-being, your sense of power. Let's say you have $1 million in the bank. Now, for some people, $1 million is a lot of money, and you're going to walk around strutting, walking carefree, right? The Billy strut, the billionaire strut, like you're the big man on campus, right? Some people with $1 million in their bank account, it's whatever. It's not that much money. It's da-da-da. Those are two perceptions of what $1 million represents. It's relative. What's happening is that when you perceive $1 million, the amount of security and power and potential that you get from that amount is a dopaminergic internal representation. For some people, you're going to have a high dopamine with $1 million. For some people, I don't know who these people would be. It's definitely not me. For some people, $1 million isn't going to do that much. it's a dopaminergic representation. It's pretty wild. Like if you have a ton of food in your fridge, like if you feel secure, like your sense of power and well-being is a dopaminergic representation, and it can be dysregulated. Like you could be $1 million in debt and still feel like, oh yeah, I'm a big man. Like that means your dopamine system like is not functioning properly. Dopamine is a single thing that gets us to do anything. Now, so we have this built-in reward system, right? This is the dopamine system, and it gets us to do things. It gets us to move towards things, to spend energy on things, to invest in things. And yeah, and sometimes like, all right, and so the question would be, how is this system set up, and what is it like? What are the things that will allow for the highest release of dopamine? It turns out that this is a difficult question to answer. So some people, like, they'll play video games all day because they're getting that minor hit of dopamine, right? And so you can have this system can become miscalibrated. And so various things had different kinds of dopamine release. And what we can think about is, well, how do we regulate the system maximally? What types of motivations allow for this system to function at its highest level in the most stable and you could say harmonious way? So when we think about when you think about addictions, right, that's an example of where the dopamine system has become dysregulated, where you're just snorting cocaine all day. And basically what that is, we'll talk more about this maybe probably in part 3, but when you have a reward with no pain, reward with no effort, like sniffing cocaine or eating a bunch of donuts or playing a bunch of video games, that's where the system becomes dysregulated and you get led down kind of this dead end. But there are certain types of motivations and activities and actions that will allow for this dopamine system to become fully activated and will result in what most people would consider well-regulated behavior that leads you into a higher place. So they've actually done experiments on this. It's kind of interesting. There's two primary ways in which the dopamine system is maximized. And this is important because you think, okay, well, let's say the hero story is true, right? You say, okay, Steve, so the hero story is true. Well, how does it express itself in our biology? Is it only true, let's say, in heaven, just somewhere in our minds, right? Is it only true just anecdotally that, sure, a lot of people like it, but what does that really mean? Or is it also true within our physiology, in our DNA? Well, let's think about that. So, according to Huberman, and Huberman is my primary source here, Huberman and Peterson, there's two ways to maximize your dopamine system. The first one is pretty interesting. So, they had this experiment done in the 60s where they isolated different areas of the brain and they determined where certain pleasurable stimuli came from. So, for example, certain places simulated sexual pleasure. Some simulated intoxicated pleasure. So there's all these different kinds of stimuli. And they had all these different sensors, and they gave someone the ability to trigger different areas of the brain, whether it's sexual stimuli or, right, again, alcohol or, intoxication, these different things. And the place that people continued to press, that they would just press over and over again, where do you think it was? You're probably thinking sex, right? I mean, what is more motivating than sexual stimuli, right? That is this desire to procreate and to advance our species. But actually, that's not the most stimulating. The most stimulating was this area in the brain called the midline thalamus, specifically the nucleus reunion. Now, the nucleus reunion, this area, is very much connected to the main dopamine centers, which is, go back to our cool little diagram here. The main dopamine centers is this ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. So I don't think the nucleus reunion is listed on this particular one. But the midline thalamus is directly connected to these systems, and it will, I think not all dopamine is created equal. It will release a type of dopaminergic sensation that people become absolutely addicted to, probably in a good way, and I'll explain why. So this stimuli is identical to a sensation noticed in rats when they voluntarily approached danger. So it was signaled by tail flicking. So these mice or rats would voluntarily approach something that made them afraid, but they would do it in a very strategic and measured way. They wouldn't just fly into danger like they wouldn't just go in. They would kind of look around. They would very carefully approach fear stimuli. So it's voluntary approach in the face of fear stimuli. The feeling is mild frustration and anticipation. It's kind of a weird, you wouldn't expect it. Mild frustration and anticipation. This technically, through scientific experimentation, is the most pleasurable feeling on the planet. Like it's our internal biology's most pleasurable sensation. And it is only, this part is only tickled, this nucleus reunion is only tickled by voluntary approach towards fear stimuli. So you have to, again, the word is voluntary. That means you engage your prefrontal cortex. You start spinning up different contexts, different narratives. How do I approach this thing? What would it look like? How do I not die? Should I do it this way? Should I do it that way? There's this girl at work who, I've had some conflict with, and there's a part of me that's afraid to engage with her. And part of me wants to either fight her or fly away from her. It's a fight or flight thing. Because I'm not sure if I'm going to lose my temper, and also she's a little bit scary, and, it's like, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, but, everyone's a little scary. And so I'm trying to figure out, how do I engage this? And so what I'm doing is I'm spinning up these different contexts. What if I did this? What if I did that, right? But what I want to do is approach her in a way such that I engage her in a courteous way, that I am cordial and polite no matter what her response is. So that's me voluntary approaching in a strategic way towards something that I perceive as dangerous, something that I perceive as risky. And actually, I don't know that it feels like it in the moment, but there is something kind of satisfying about that feeling. Now, to me, that kind of sounds like the hero story. That what the hero does is there is reluctance because there's the perception of fear. This is the fear of the unknown. But what the hero does is he begins to embrace this destiny. That he begins to move towards that fear, just like the knight in shining armor moves towards that dragon. The reason why this hero's narrative is so enduring and has had such pervasive adoption for such a long period of time, part of it could be is that it's actually the most pleasurable thing you can do. Like, it's actually completely optimized towards our motivational system. And there is only one motivational system, and that is the dopamine system. There's only one molecule that motivates us. It's pretty wild. So basically, voluntary. Voluntary movement towards fear is the best way to regulate our motivational system. And part of the reason for that, and this gets into the second way to regulate your dopamine system, is that it contains fear. It contains an element of pain. It contains an element of discomfort. Now compare that to like all these addictive things, right? Snorting cocaine, playing video games. None of these things contain a component of fear or contain a component of pain. Like you don't have reluctance to eat a donut. There's nothing there's nothing scary about it. You just eat it and then you get the dopamine hit. And then what happens? The system becomes dysregulated. You just start eating donut after donut after donut. That's because the system is not regulated by pain and fear. So that's the second thing. When you're choosing your motivations, when you're trying to figure out how to channel this desire, like you need dopamine, you have to have it. You need, first of all, you need it to move. But second, I think it's fundamental to your sense of well-being. Like your mental health is dependent on it. If you had no dopamine, Huberman tells a story where he got injected for something because he had this crazy diarrhea, and he got injected with it. And what it did is it blocked all of his dopamine receptors. And he said, like in 5 minutes, he was just crying, like he was just super depressed, like just a complete mess. And he's going to the he's like hitting the nurse button. He's like like what did you do to me? Like what did you inject me with? And they told me, he's like, oh my god, that blocks my dopamine receptors. Like you need to inject the antidote that reverses that. And then he said after that injection in 15 minutes, he was totally fine. Like you have to have dopamine. How do you get it? What is the best way to get it? Like if we're just going to be purely like, how do we hack this system? Well, whatever you pursue needs to involve an element of pain. There has to be something difficult, painful, something that makes you reluctant. And so it's this really subtle combination of something that you greatly desire, but something that scares you, and something that's going to certainly be painful to do. And if you can find that rare combination of things, this is the key that unlocks you. If you can find that rare combination of things, then you're going to have a very well regulated dopamine output. It's going to be balanced by pain and fear. And so the system will not kind of spike off the rails and spike down. It's not going to do this. What it is you're going to have this nice wave action. And that's actually what I experienced with this, because essentially what he talks about, it's what I call the Goggins effect. I don't know if you ever listened to David Goggins. David Goggins is this guy that's become famous for encouraging you to embrace the grind, embrace the pain. He's like, motivation is bullshit. He's like, you need to do it when you're not motivated. You need to do it when it's rainy, when it's cold out, when you're tired, when you feel a little sick, when you work so hard the day before, when you have all these excuses to not do something. That's when you need to step up and do it. He's talking about the hero story. He's talking about tickling the nucleus reunion and triggering that intensely, strangely pleasurable feeling, the mild frustration and anticipation. Essentially, what you need to do is find a way to derive pleasure from effort. That's what Huberman calls, he says, is pleasure from effort. And that is regulated by your prefrontal cortex. In a way, you intuitively understand this. If you ever go to the gym and work out, people go to the gym. They love the gym. They pay $60 a month. I mean, they want to get in shape. Sure, they want the reward, of course. But people who really love the gym love the process. They love the exertion. Exertion is like hard work in some sense, then is its own reward. Exertion is rewarding because you feel like you accomplished something. Again, it's that combination of pain and anticipation. That's what you're looking for. Now, the ultimate motivation then is to pursue something that you love so much that you even love the effort that you have to put into it. You love the process of it. So that's going to be, if you're looking for that hero story, that's kind of what you're looking for. But yeah, to me it's really interesting that, so when you think about how we're set up, the hero story is about voluntary action. It's about overcoming your autonomic, your involuntary responses, the prefrontal. It's about spinning up different narratives, trying to find the right narrative. And the right narrative is going to be the one with the biggest reward. That should be the one that you pursue. But that reward will be somewhat disguised because it's going to be accompanied by fear and accompanied by pain. That's why it's a mistake then. Like when I was first starting out when I was young, and this is totally a rookie move. This is just like what every young person does. They're trying to find the easiest path with the easiest path with the biggest reward. What can I do with the least amount of effort that generates the most amount of reward? That's what like most people do. That's what I was trying to do. But that's actually wrong. What you want to do is find the most painful, the most fear-inducing path that generates the biggest reward. Like you still want that big reward, but you want one that makes you a little bit afraid, like I don't know, like, can I even do that? So basically, what our neurology is saying is that we're optimized for pain, that we're optimized for fear, that we actually need pain and fear to regulate our systems, that we can't have, if we get pleasure outside of pain and fear without hard work, then what will happen is we'll get that spike in dopamine, and then we'll just get that drop, and it won't mean anything, right? You ever thought that? What doesn't really mean anything? I didn't really work for it. If someone, let's say I just hand you a trophy, you didn't do anything. Like, here's a trophy. You're an outstanding person. You're gonna look at me like this is bullshit. You just throw it away. It doesn't mean anything to you. There's no dopaminergic value attached to it. If you're celebrated for something, if you receive accolades for something, sure, for a while it might feel good, but if you didn't suffer for it, your dopamine's going to drop. You're no longer going to receive a reward from it. So that is the story of our neurology, that we're designed for pain and fear, that we're not going to receive reward. We're not going to feel that sense of well-being, that sense of energy, that sense of excitement and motivation unless we're pursuing something, approaching something that we feel is dangerous and painful. It's kind of weird. But that does kind of map onto this hero story, where the hero is reluctant. Why? Because there's an unknown aspect that generates fear and pain. That the hero is not entirely sure that they can handle this thing that's calling towards them. They're afraid that they're not going to be able to do it, or that maybe this isn't what they really want. Like, maybe I think it's mostly just fear. If it's the right thing, it's a difficult thing to figure out, but if it's that thing that's calling you, but then if you can step into that destiny, right? If you can step into that dopaminergic sweet spot, if you can follow your dopamine system where it wants to move towards fear and pain, then you're going to get that lasting reward. And we'll talk about how dopamine changes your system. But there is a reward, and actually it transforms who you are. Dopamine transforms your physiology, and it really does make you into a hero. Like, it's really crazy. It's almost like this, it's like the spice. It's like this super serum. So, yeah, so that's the tale of Earth. That's the imprint of our. That's the the imprint, the design of our physiology, of our primary motivational system. Something in our design is inducing you, is motivating you towards fear and pain. It's pretty wild, you know. It's paradoxical. It's paradoxical, but that's how the system has been designed. That's what it's inducing you towards. And then if you do that, you're going to have all sorts of dopaminergic internal representations of the things that you receive based on the work that you put in, the effort that you put in towards exploring this very fearful and painful option. So there you go. That's how you fulfill your destiny. That's how you actually activate your primary reward system. So yeah, that is part 2 of the Hero Lecture. And I don't know. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't know if you have any questions or anything. Thank you for watching. I think this is the one guy who... Actually, I don't even know your name. One of my biggest fans, I guess. I hope. But yeah, man, thank you so much for watching, and definitely feel free to ask me questions or anything like that. We're gonna do 3 to 4, probably 3 to 4 more versions of this very same lecture. So hopefully it gets better with each rendition. But yeah, that's where we're at, man. Okay, blessings to everyone.